awareness of what's happening. It's the only way we're going to be able to improve the efficiency, the effectiveness, the accountability of government is to have that type of transparency. My own initial involvement with the importance of Inspector Generals really came after the Cartagena incident. Now, I come from the private sector. I've had independent financial auditors. I've had surveillance auditors with ISO certification. I mean, these are some independent outside groups that provide that independent oversight. This is about as good as we can do within government. Having, obviously government employees, but we need that independence, transparency. After the Cartagena hearing, where we had the Director of the Secret Service, Mark Sullivan, testifying before us, it was determined that we would have an inspection, an investigation conducted by the Inspector General's office. My staff went down in a secure briefing to read the initial report. A couple months later, when that report was actually issued, we realized that there were parts of the report that were originally included in that had been taken out of the report inappropriately, which led to a continuing investigation on the part of our subcommittee to find out that there were some other problems with Charles Edwards, and we issued a report supported by both sides. A couple days before we had a hearing with Mr. Charles Edwards, he resigned, went on to some other duty. The result of the lack of transparency, the lack of what I think would be reports with integrity based on what was happening within the Secret Service, the cultural problems of the Secret Service, the net result of that is we have not reformed the Secret Service. We are still continuing to have credibility within an agency that I think is incredibly important to have the utmost credibility. So that's one circumstance that was my first, certainly being made aware of how incredibly important it is to have completely independent, completely transparent offices of Inspector General. And of course, Charles Edwards' problems with him is he was an acting IG, and he was openly vying for the permanent IG position, so you have a natural conflict of interest right there, which I think was at the heart of that problem. Fast forward. We saw the revelations in Arizona in terms of the VA healthcare system. People dying waiting to be given care. Now that information was broken through news reports, not revealed to the public where it should have been revealed through the Office of Inspector General of the VA. In our own state, Senator Baldwin's state and mine, further news reports revealed early this year that there are similar problems in the Toma VA Healthcare Center, where because of overprescription of opiate drugs, veterans died. And in particular, the day I learned about it, early in January, on January 12th, Candace Dellis took her father, Thomas Baer, into the Toma VA facility. He was suffering stroke victims. He waited somewhere between 2 and 3 hours, probably suffered a couple strokes. In the end, he was transported to Gunnison Lutheran in La Crosse. He died a couple days later. He basically died of neglect. Now, had the Office of Inspector General been transparent, had the office not administratively closed a report that we'd been working on a couple of years, had that report been made public, what Candace Dellis told me on the phone a few days after I learned of the incident, she said, Senator, had I known that there were problems with the Toma VA system, the healthcare system, I never would have taken my father to that facility. Now what's really sad is Candace Dellis, Thomas Baer, lived in Marshfield, Wisconsin, a world-class healthcare facility resides in Marshfield, Wisconsin. Thomas Baer would have been alive had we had the type of transparency, the type of independence in an Office of Inspector General within the VA system. I truly believe that. So these issues aren't just theoretical. This isn't just about, good government. People's lives can be in the balance here. So these are incredibly important issues. The purpose of this hearing is really to, I think, first convey how important that independent and transparent function is of Office of Inspector General, and then secondly, to find out why this White House, who claimed, this administration, who claimed to be and wanting to be the most transparent administration in history, has taken so long to fill so many positions of inspector generals. I mean, here's just a couple examples. The State Department went 1,701 days without a permanent inspector general. That's more than 4.5 years before that position was finally filled. The Interior Department is right now holding the current record, 2,291 days, 6.25 years since we've had a permanent inspector general within the Department of Interior. Labor was pretty bad. The Department of Labor, 1,555 days. That position went vacant. That's more than 4.25 years. Now, let's just compare past administrations. The Reagan administration, the average days of vacancy was about 224 days. Under the first President Bush, it was about 337 days. Under Bill Clinton, 453 days average vacancy. Under the second President Bush, 280 days. Under President Obama, the average vacancy has been 613 days. You know, 1 in 2/3 years. These vacancies have gone vacant. They have not been filled. That's a problem. Now, again, we've got a good panel here to describe and fulfill the first purpose of this hearing, which is describe how important the Office of Inspector General is to be independent and transparent. Unfortunately, we don't have the White House's version of the events. And let me just read a timeline in terms of our attempt to get the White House to give us that information, this committee the information. On May 14th, we first reached out to the White House about this hearing and invited Valerie Green, who is the director of the Office of Presidential Personnel. I mean, that would be the person within the White House that could give us that answer. Why have these positions gone unfilled for so long? On May 19th, we began discussions with the White House counsel's office after the White House said it would not send Ms. Green. On May 22nd, we formally invited Ms. Green and offered the White House to send a designee from her office if it could not send Ms. Green. On May 27th, the White House rejected the invitation and said it would only send Beth Colbert, who we all like. I mean, I have a great deal of respect for Beth Colbert. We all do here on the committee. But she's the Deputy Director for Management at the Office of Management and Budget. She's not involved in these decisions in terms of these nominations. She's not in that Office of Presidential Personnel. She obviously has some tie-in with Siggy, but she could not answer the questions. She would not be in the position to answer the questions that this committee is trying to ascertain. On May 28th, we again reiterated to the White House that Ms. Colbert is not an appropriate witness because she plays no part in the White House's nomination process. We also highlighted a 2012 House hearing in which an OMB witness testified on this matter, and they could not answer the members' questions about the nomination process because, quote, they have no role in that, unquote. On May 28th, we invited the former director of the office, Jonathan McBride, who is now working in the private sector at BlackRock. The White House told BlackRock and Mr. McBride that it does not want Mr. McBride to testify and asked him not to speak with us. On June 4th, the committee offered to accept a non-public briefing with the Office of Presidential Personnel in lieu of testimony today. Yesterday, Mr. McBride refused to testify and directed the committee to speak to the White House. Also yesterday, the White House said it would not provide members with a briefing, is not sending Ms. Green or anyone else from that office, and is refusing to allow the former director of that office to testify. This is very disappointing to this committee. I think this is our responsibility to conduct this oversight, and we're not going to get the information from the White House, which is the second purpose of this hearing. So I think it's unfortunate, but I wanted to put that on the record. And with that, I'll turn it over to our ranking member, Senator Mr. Epstein. I'd like to start with you, as long as you raise the issue about the FOIA request through NARA and the Office of Inspector General for the State Department. You say that with your FOIA request, you found out that NARA said there were responsive documents that were not supplied by the State Department to your FOIA request?
Yeah, that's correct. And actually, it's one of the exhibits that I submitted with written testimony. We actually FOIA'd for very similar things, both to the State Department OIG and to NARA, which was quite simply, we wanted communications, any records of communications about whether there were investigations into Clinton's email use. The current OIG, and the time period was from January 2009 to the present, the current OIG responded that there were no responsive records. We have a document from NARA that says there is a communication with the State Department OIG, but they withheld it under an exemption known as B5, which is deliberative process.
That's where we want to get. So you know there were responsive documents, but you have not gotten those responsive documents.
Yeah, the likelihood is we have filed an appeal. We would likely have to litigate that question. And I can tell you from the perspective of good government groups, litigation usually does not prove fruitful for getting transparency. It is a last resort type of thing.
Okay, well, again, thank you for your work on that, and this committee will certainly follow up on that. Mr. Horowitz, your SIGI has, since 2009, recommended about 114 potential IGs
That's correct.
for those vacancies, correct?
That's correct.
Do you know what happens to those?
Once we make a recommendation, we don't know what the process is thereafter.
Do you know what how many of those 114 potential nominees have actually been selected by the administration and appointed?
As I sit here, I don't know the number off the top of my head.
But the bottom line is, certainly SIGI believes there are a lot of potentially qualified inspector generals for this administration to appoint.
Right, that's correct, and it's certainly been far less than 100 that have been selected, so there are still many candidates available.
Now, I believe the maximum number of days that somebody can serve as an acting IG is 210 days, correct?
That's my understanding.
How many acting IGs right now have exceeded that?
Well, since as I mentioned, 7 of the 8 vacancies exceed 1 year, or will exceed 1 year. That's certainly more than 210 days.
So how does the administration get around that statutory requirement?
Well, what has happened is the acting IGs, which are often the deputy inspectors general, simply fall back to be the deputy inspector general. And there is no acting, and there is no confirmed IG.
So it's really form over substance. They all of a sudden change your title from acting IG, and they become a deputy IG again, and they serve as an acting IG.
Someone needs to make some decisions within the office, so that is what ends up happening.
That's certainly one of the areas that we need to find some reform on. There's got to be some enforcement mechanism for that statutory requirement. Is that basically your understanding?
Well, that somebody needs to make some decisions with regard to that. Certainly the best way to do it is to get nominees pending and confirmed.
Okay. I've got a lot of questions. Hopefully we'll have time for second round.
You're the chairman.
I know. Got a lot of people. I know, I'm in charge. Ms. Brian, in being brief for this hearing, I did find out something rather disturbing, that the Office of Pogo had been ransacked, broken into is probably the best. Can you describe what happened there?
Yes, sir. It was a few months ago when staff came to Pogo for work that morning and found that one of the filing cabinets had clearly been tried to be jimmied open, and it was, at that time, we hadn't had quite the physical security that we now have established in our offices. We called the police for them to investigate, and we're in sort of a typical Washington office building where we're not the only office in that building, and none of the other offices in that building had been burglared, nor had there been anything else in town, according to the police, in that particular area. And so the police concluded that it was because of the kind of work that we do, that it was an information gathering. There were also some desks that clearly materials had been moved around on the desks, so it was clearly someone who was trying to find something that was in our office.
Well, was there any information missing that you're aware of, or?
It's one of those things, we don't know what we don't know. So it was not clear to us what was taken, if anything, or if it was just photographs that were taken, for example, of our desks. And we were able to establish that our servers had not been violated. But certainly because of that, we have significantly ramped up physical security and cybersecurity for our offices.
In your testimony, you talked about acting IGs auditioning for the permanent IG slot. That's certainly what we saw as a real problem with Charles Edwards. Can you just describe what happens there, the type of department or agency capture of that acting IG, and how damaging that is to independence and transparency?
Yes, well, I mean, I certainly have been actually lobbied by acting IGs specifically asking for our support in their efforts to become a permanent IG, so I've witnessed it firsthand. And what happens, of course, because IGs are dual-hatted, they both report to the Congress, but also to the head of an agency. And because the head of any IG's agency has significant say in who is the appointee to be the IG, what we see is that those acting IGs over and over again try to curry favor with the head of that agency in order to get that appointment. And what that means is making sure that they are not only not doing hard-hitting independent work while they're in charge of the Inspector General's office, but often we are also finding that they are deliberately trying to cover up bad news that should be revealed, as you mentioned, you saw with the VA IG.
So in other words, they may decide not to pursue a particular investigation. They may, in a report, doctor, or certainly not have his hard-hitting report, maybe remove things at the bequest of the different agencies, which is what we saw with Charles Edwards. Is that the type of specific activity you're talking about?
Oh, yes. I mean, I can give you another specific example with the Department of Defense IG, where there was actually quite an extraordinary investigation where, at the time, CIA Director Panetta had improperly released information about the identities of the people involved in the Zero Dark 30 raid to filmmakers. And he had then moved over to become the Secretary of Defense. The then acting IG for DOD was responsible for the investigation into the allegation of that release of information and what happened. We were leaked a draft IG report that had been sitting in the DOD IG for over a year that identified the fact that Secretary Panetta, as well as other senior staff, had in fact released highly classified information, and that report was being squelched. So we released it, and almost within a month, that acting Pentagon IG released a scrubbed version of that report where there was no mention of Mr. Panetta. And he was, of course, someone who would have been helpful in Ms. Halbrook's getting the permanent position had she gotten what she was working towards.
Okay. Well, thank you for your work. Senator Carper. Thank you, Senator Ayotte, for your passion on this issue. I think you missed my opening comments about the Toma VA and the daughter of Thomas Baer, who told me over the phone that if she'd only known, in other words, if the Office of Inspector General had only issued a report so the public understood the problems of the Toma VA, she never would have taken her father where he basically died in neglect to that facility. So these are issues of life or death, and thank you for your passion on this. Mr. Horowitz, we obviously have this committee. I've had some real problems with the VA Inspector General, Mr. Griffin. Because of the Toma VA situation, we have been trying to get information, trying to get the case file. It was revealed in a news report that there are 140 different inspections and investigations where reports have been issued that had not been made public. We could not get the case file. We could not get the communications. Even though we worked with the Office of Inspector General for a number of months, we finally had to take the extraordinary step of issuing a subpoena. Now, we have the power to issue that subpoena. I wish we wouldn't have had to do that. We issued that subpoena on April 29th, looking for response by May 13th. We've received some response, but not complete responsiveness. I want to just ask you, because I'm actually kind of shocked that the Office of Inspector General subpoenaed the officers of POGO. Do officers of Inspector General have that power to subpoena a group like POGO?
Under the IG Act, inspectors general have authority to issue documentary subpoenas to outside organizations. I don't know the facts of.
Do you think that's an appropriate subpoena to that group? Looking to find out who the whistleblowers are.
I would not in my position, consider issuing a subpoena to any organization to look for information about whistleblowers.
Has CIGI opened up an investigation in your integrity section against this Office of Inspector General?
I would have to reach out to the Integrity Committee because that's chaired by the FBI by statute. It's not.
I would ask that you check into that for me. Mr. Epstein.
Yeah, I would actually respectfully disagree with IG Horowitz. I actually don't think the VA OIG under the Inspector General Act has any authority to subpoena any outside entity that has no purpose that deals with federal program administration. Subpoenaing an organization that is out there protecting whistleblowers and conducting oversight over the federal government has nothing to do with a programmatic function. It is clearly ultra vires under the Inspector General Act.
You know, from my standpoint, I think one of the primary functions, one of the primary roles of the Office of Inspector General is to investigate cases where the agencies and departments are retaliating against whistleblowers. I mean, whistleblowers is really kind of, you know, that shedding the sunlight that whistleblowers bring to Congress and bring to the public. It's about the only way we can reform and improve the efficiency and effectiveness of government. And so we offer those whistleblower protections so that we encourage those people to come forward. When the Office of Inspector General, and that's, of course, what happened with Charles Edwards. I think that's probably the most egregious problem with the Office under Inspector Charles Edwards is he was retaliating against people that were issuing reports that he didn't like. So, you know, Ms. Brian, you talked about in your testimony that Richard Griffin, his office, had undermined whistleblowers. Can you describe that a little bit more?
Well, as soon as the subpoena occurred, we felt it was our responsibility to alert people who were contacting us that such an inquiry had taken place and that we certainly intended not to comply with it. But as you can imagine, there was some wonderful support from former chairman or former Senator Coburn, also who wrote to them demanding an explanation of why they were doing this. But the bottom line was it creates a chilling effect because now you have people who thought, okay, well, this is a safe place to go, and we are doing everything that we can to protect their identity. But to think that there is an office that has the capacity, whether they do or not, they were trying to exercise the capacity to identify who the people were coming to us. It had a terrible chilling effect.
And again, was that the only purpose of that subpoena? Is there any other justification for the subpoena you received from the Office of Inspector General for the Veterans Administration?
You would have to ask them, but I think the fact that we said we were very happy to work with them to identify what information we were getting without identifying details of who the people were, and they weren't interested in any conversations of that kind.
Can any of the three witnesses speak to other instances of this type of retaliation against whistleblowers or retaliation within the Office of Inspector General? I mean, we obviously saw it with Charles Edwards. We're seeing it here, I think, with the Office of Inspector General at the VA. Are there other instances of this? Is this widespread, or is this really not an anomaly?
Well, Senator, as I mentioned in my oral testimony, there's currently a case involving, and this is actually a confirmed IG at the Commerce Department, who has been found through House investigations to have retaliated against whistleblowers. And as it turned out, it's only recently become clear that Todd Zinsser had withheld evidence that, in fact, he had been found to have retaliated previously against whistleblowers from the confirmation process. And so we have sort of a current case where you have someone who is a sitting IG where that's taken place. And that actually...
Now, is he still in that position?
Yes, he is. And we have asked the president to remove him. So that's something that I think is also worth noting. When you mentioned earlier, of course, we all feel a great urgency in filling a vacancy, for example, at the VA IG. But I wouldn't, once there is a nominee, I really would encourage the Congress and the Senate in particular to take the role of confirmation very seriously. That's part of why you need to not have such a lengthy process before the nomination, because you need to give the Congress time to do a thorough vetting as well.
This committee is dedicated to that. Mr. Epstein, I don't want the moment to pass because I know you've done an awful lot of work with the State Department's Office of Inspector General in terms of how they may or may not have responded to the revelation that Secretary Clinton was storing probably official emails on a private server. Can you just give us your thoughts in terms of how a permanent Inspector General should have responded to knowledge that Secretary Clinton was, I believe, violating State Department protocols and policies?
Well, Senator, we know for a fact, based off NARA's response, the same inquiry we sent to the OIG, that the OIG has records in its possession concerning whether Hillary Clinton was complying with the Federal Records Act. And I think in this case, Harold Geisel, from a lot of work that's been made public by others, was viewed even by the GAO as having a conflict of interest. So I think what a permanent IG would have done is avoided that conflict of interest that we've all discussed and actually been able to get that information public in a report. We know that Mr. Linick, who is now the IG, has been very active in doing thorough reports about email record preservation at the State Department, and that is something that, had he been in place earlier, we may have had a lot of these problems been avoided.
Are you aware whether Mr. Geisel was aware of Secretary Clinton's violation of the policies?
From what the records that my organization has received, we know that there's a substantial likelihood that at the time he was the acting IG at the State Department, there were records or communications in his possession that were shared with the National Archives concerning Hillary Clinton's record preservation. But I could only speculate as to whether he was directly involved or whether it was others in his office.
Okay, but again, you don't have the documented evidence of that. All you know is that there were some documents or a document that was responsive to a FOIA request that you simply can't get a hold of.
Yeah, the National Archives has said that those records are subject to deliberative process.
Okay, thank you. Senator Carper.
Mr.
Oh,
Chairman,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, I realize there's another example that I made a quick reference to in my oral testimony of a current retaliation case. Yesterday, it was reported by McClatchy newspapers that a federal judge is investigating allegations that the then acting Department of Defense IG destroyed documents during the high-profile leak investigation of NSA whistleblower Thomas Drake. We've seen the letter to the federal judge, and the federal magistrate has sent to the public integrity section of the Justice Department requesting that they look into this matter. And the two people who were referred, one was the then acting Inspector General Lynn Halbrooks, who's just retired, but also the current General Counsel of the DoD IG, Henry Shelley.
Well, thank you for that. Mr. Horowitz, I think your integrity section is going to be somewhat busy here. Mr. Senator Carper. Witnesses, you took a lot of time and prepared from some very thoughtful testimony. Appreciate your answers to our question. So, I think in terms of the two purposes of this hearing, we certainly fulfilled the first. I think we certainly understand how important these positions of permanent inspector generals are. These people have to have integrity. They need to be totally accountable and completely transparent. That's absolutely necessary. Unfortunately, we really didn't find out why these vacancies have gone on so long. We'll continue to work with the White House to try and determine and get that answer. We will continue to work with the White House and apply pressure on them to get these appointments made, particularly with the VA. And Mr. Horowitz, really count on you working with the SIGI to, take a look at the integrity section here and investigate some of these issues that have been raised during this hearing. And this committee also we are dedicated to move quickly on the nomination of Ms. Ochoa for the Inspector General for the GSA. With that, let me just say the hearing record will remain open for another 15 days until June 18th at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.